Welcome back to Indomitable Interactive's Hindi Highlight. Today I want to talk about a Metroidvania by the name of Axiom Verge. Made entirely by one person, Tom Happ, this game is surprisingly extensive with tons of features and a fairly large map as well. This game is a great homage to Metroid, but it is certainly a good Metroidvania in its own right. Overall, I would say this game is good with some small problems holding it back from being great. So let's get into it. First off, I think the art and general feel of the game is one of its best aspects. The somewhat mismatching tile-based pixel art captures the look of NES games better than most modern pixel art in my opinion. Certain areas look particularly gritty and like they were ripped from an actual 1986 Nintendo Entertainment System release. The same goes for projectile and enemy designs. Beyond just the art though, the feel of the game matches that of an NES game for me. The movement is simple and straightforward, tight and responsive. It overall feels exactly like you would expect. I would also say the enemy behaviors are reminiscent of old school difficulty, in that there are some very difficult enemies and some spots that remind me of old school NES bullshit. By that I mean enemies appearing out of nowhere and just being generally impossible to dodge. I would usually refer to these as dick moves. They're almost a charming part of retro platformers, and they appear throughout this game in my opinion, but they aren't too frequent. The enemies, on the other hand, do lead me to one aspect of the game that seriously bothers me, and that is the enemy difficulty. And I do not mean the previously mentioned behavior, it really comes down to how much damn health some of these enemies have. It feels like an unfair, artificial difficulty to me, and not the kind of unfair that can still be fun, it's the kind that feels like an overly annoying chore. Only certain enemies are this way, but nonetheless they make traversing some areas a serious hassle that devolves into an unfun tank fest. Like I said though, this is only some of the enemies, and it isn't like every single area of the game is unbearable, but I certainly found myself legitimately frustrated during some parts of the game, particularly in the early game with these guys, and in the late game with these motherfuckers. Nonetheless, I would not say that the enemies impeded the exploration in the game, which is of course a very important aspect of Metroidvanias. Early on, the exploration was great. I found myself running through areas looking for secrets, and I felt that the progression was at about the right speed, with getting to new areas frequently enough to keep me engaged and feeling like I was making legitimate progress. However, I got pretty stuck in the mid to late game. Once you've traversed across the map to the other side, backtracking requires a specific upgrade. This ended up being like the third upgrade I found in this area, where I thought each one before it was the key to backtracking. Generally in a Metroidvania, when I get a fancy new ability, I go and backtrack to the beginning of the game, looking for new areas I can explore. This often allows me to either find the next area to further progress, or at least pick up a few optional secret upgrades. Nonetheless, I found myself returning to the same area over and over again to find upgrades that would allow me to get back to other parts of the map. I'm trying to keep out any spoilers here, but I swear this area has like 5 mandatory upgrades, and a small connected area has yet another one. Most other areas have anywhere between 2 and 0. This part of the game is what made the exploration feel a bit off for me after the middle of the game. I found that secrets in Axiom Verge are quite difficult to find and often didn't seem worth the effort. This is the other part of what made the exploration feel a little off. By the time I could backtrack, I struggled to find much of anything helpful, or so it felt. This includes the actual next area for progression. It left me feeling lost for a significant amount of time, which is, of course, not unheard of in Metroidvanias. I have played my fair share of them and spent a good amount of time lost. I did not generally feel frustrated about it in other games, and even if I could not seem to progress the main story, I was finding helpful secrets that would make me a lot stronger for when I eventually did progress. In Axiom Verge, secrets can be hard to find because there are so many abilities, and they are seemingly only particularly helpful in a large volume. I say this because most secrets are one of 3 things: a health fragment, of which you need 5 to actually get more health, a power fragment, of which you need 6 to actually increase your damage, or a new weapon type, most of which are very situational. This large portion of time being lost trying to find what would turn out to be just the last few areas made the game feel very disjointed to me, which feeds into my main dilemma over the game, which is my assertion that it has no flow and is instead very strategic. What I mean by this is that in other games like Hollow Knight, I can breeze through areas, especially later in the game, and I deal damage quickly and effectively to enemies, usually doing the same thing in each room, maybe at most using slightly different techniques for stronger or more annoying enemies. I'm fighting on my terms, and thus I get pretty good at traversing the map and defeating enemies in one way. I call this a flow. In Axiom Verge, however, there are over 20 different weapons, and I would argue that enemies are more diverse from one another compared to other games. This creates a lot of very situational encounters in which one particular strategy might be significantly more effective than any other. Figuring these out and putting them to effective use takes time and slows the game down a lot, which is why I say it is strategic. I can't fly through this game. It is more like surgery and requires precision. While I do personally prefer a flow type of combat, I would definitely say that neither is objectively better than the other, and it really comes down to preference. This is why I referred to it as a dilemma. I don't dock this game any points for feeling like open heart surgery, but I think it is an important aspect to explain. I do say I can't fly through this game, although I know there is one weapon in the game that is supposedly very overpowered that would probably make the game a lot easier, but I never found it. I never really found a great go-to weapon for traversing the map, which is really why I say it felt so strategic. If you find a great weapon that works for you in most situations, then you may disagree with my assessment here. Also, reminder that I did not find every weapon in this game. I did not 100% the game, and I merely just beat it once. If you're thinking over 20 weapons is a lot, well, I have to agree. I don't necessarily find it problematic, but certainly a little overwhelming. There are some weapons that seem utterly useless, and then several that stand out above the rest, which I think is to be expected. A lot of the strategy I speak of comes not from defeating enemies throughout the map, but in boss fights. I found that a lot of them were very difficult until I found a good weapon and strategy for the fight that would make it pretty easy. I found it a little frustrating at times, but figuring out a good technique for each boss was like a little game on its own that I did find enjoyable by itself. Along with there being a lot of weapons, there are a large number of abilities as well. I played this game on and off over the course of a few months, so I constantly found myself forgetting what abilities I had, which made finding secrets and just generally progressing kind of difficult at times. This was more of a me problem, so I can't really blame it on the game, but I do think that even under normal circumstances, having this many abilities does make finding secrets more tedious, as they can be hidden in numerous different ways. However, I thought a lot of the abilities were pretty fun and just all around cool. The game has a theme around glitches, where certain areas are blocked off by glitches that you must fix with upgrades. These abilities can also glitch enemies, which is a way of weakening them. It seems every single enemy has its own unique effect from being glitched, which is really cool. This theme just works really well and feeds into the game's story, which I won't get into the specifics of, but will say was good. Because of the fact that I played the game over the course of a relatively long period of time, I did not get particularly invested in the story. However, I still found what I did catch fairly intriguing and did genuinely want to beat the game to see how it would end. Overall, it's a pretty interesting premise with some serious twists and turns, and I think paying attention to the story would very much pay off. I would give this game a 6 out of 10. I think the art, environments, controls, and enemies really play into a great old school vibe and paint the picture of an alien universe very well. The story is intriguing, the combat is interesting, and the boss fights are decent. The sheer volume of content, from the number of weapons and abilities to the decent sized map, is insanely impressive coming from just one developer, so mad respect to Tom Happ. These things make the game great, but I do think it is brought down by the exploration after about halfway through, and some frustrating and unfair difficulty that I simply did not enjoy throughout. And do not come at me in the comments saying I just don't like a challenge, because I love difficult games like Hollow Knight, Katana Zero, or Celeste, and doing tough challenges like the Path of Pain, Hard Mode, or B-Sides, respectively. Obviously, someone will comment that those aren't that hard, but most of you get my point. Nonetheless, if you like Metroidvanias and a challenge, or just retro platformers, I think this game is worth checking out. As always, Steam page and dev socials in the description down below, and thanks for watching.